Dawn was fast approaching. I called Sterling Fairchild, whose Tigers were near the action, and ordered him to set up an ambush on the trail I was sure the enemy would use to withdraw before first light. The Tiger Company started to over the very busy battalion command net that he didn't want to do it. He was close to rotation and didn't want to get knocked off. I had more things on my mind than Fairchild's excuses. "Just do it," I snapped. Next, I got Ben Willis's Aboose moving toward Wan's battery while supporting the defending gunners with mortar fire. B and C companies were poised for a first light airmobile assault deep behind the enemy's escape route. Between these units and the 502, I had 5 strong forces to chop up the NVA withdrawal and pick off their stragglers. I was confident because I felt I'd been down this road before. The situation was not that much different than what the Wolfhounds had experienced in April of '51 at the outset of the Chinese spring offensive. Then the Chinese had penetrated G Company and had them all on the run, but by morning the penetration had been sealed and the Chinese could not withdraw. They were caught in a sack not unlike what I was trying to draw now, and we had destroyed them in detail. I don't know how or when I got word that Fairchild had disobeyed my order. All I know was that the ambush was not set, no sack was drawn, and come dawn, many an enemy soldier slipped away down that very trail. Fortunately, the plan was not totally blown, despite what I considered Fairchild's act of cowardice. Between my other elements and our tremendous supporting fire, including Puff the Magic Dragon, an aircraft whose mounted Gatling guns spat 450 rounds per second, enough to cover the area of a football field in 3 seconds with a slug hitting every square foot along the way. A first light sweep of the area revealed 86 enemy dead from the 24th NVA Regiment. Our own casualties for the night were 4 Americans, KIA, and 10 wounded. Still, I was furious. After moving B and C companies out by chopper to sweep down from Wan's position toward the valley of the Monard Corporals, and many NVA, I brought the Tigers in and relieved Fairchild on the spot. I didn't give a damn if he was a short-timer. Almost everyone was, and some were well past their rotation dates. The Vietnam 1-year rotation policy was already panning out as it had in Korea. When people got short, they just wanted to go back to the base camp and hide under a rock. They were dead weight in an outfit. They didn't do their share, and their lousy attitude was infectious. In Fairchild's case, while it was bad enough that he, a regular officer and commander of the Tiger Force, bitched out loud on the battalion command net, the fact that he clearly disobeyed an order that might have changed the course of the battle soon to follow was inexcusable. So I relieved him and brought in another young captain, whom I'll call Neville Bumstead, to take his place. I wanted to get the Tigers out into the field again right away, just in case any of them had soaked up their UR while Commander Cold Feet. To me, the most striking irony in Fairchild's behaviour was that this officer had not only graduated from West Point, but had graduated at the top of his class in leadership. Classmates said, and I had seen for myself before this incident, that the guy couldn't make a decision. The system, or at least the criteria at West Point, had to have been seriously flawed to single out and honour a man seemingly so inappropriate to exemplify this basic and essential quality. In the middle of all this, a reporter came up to me, introduced himself as Ward Just from the Washington Post, and said he wanted to go along on one of our patrols. I gave him to Bumstead and the Tigers and hoped he'd keep his head down. Fortunately, the initiative was all ours, as the above-the-rest companies, each broken into platoon-size formations, gave me 9 manoeuvre units plus the Tigers to comb the dense highlands bush, killing stragglers 2 here and 4 there. It was the beginning of 6 days of constant contact for the battalion, trying days but ones in which the men, after a year of growing and learning on the battlefield, remained strong, resolute, and courageous. Besides an enemy who hugged our belts to neutralize our incredible firepower, the men fought lung-busting hills and virtually impassable jungle terrain. Bad, if not worse than the worst in Korea, more like the thick forest along Germany's SE front line. Though I'd long believed the CG effort to stop top NVA movement across the Laos and Cambodian borders was pretty feeble, It took me years to truly appreciate how insane it was for infantrymen to fight in the Highlands. Yet my troopers knew with every step they took, and weren't exactly shy about saying so. At one stage, when my TAC CP and I were tagging along with one of the rifle platoons, the column halted for some reason, and I took a hike up to talk to some of the troopers stretched out along the jungle track. Even though the troops knew I was the man, I wasn't wearing brass, but with an antenna platoon of at least 5 PRC-25 radios with me, it was kind of obvious. They pretended they didn't and started telling me about the stupidity of it all, how infantry couldn't fight through this terrain, that their weapons couldn't even penetrate the bush, and that the guy in charge, me, must be some dumb son of a ... I loved every second of their rant and joined right in as I scooted back to my TAC CP. I thought those kids were the ones who should be the goddamn generals. If the NVA wanted to cut the country in half, so what? All they'd have had would be a lot of thick jungle, a few monards, and one hell of a lot of malaria. The Highlands had no real strategic value. The key to the war was the people. Protect the people, make their lives better, win them, and you'd have won the war. But in early June 1966, such thoughts had not occurred to me, and the Central Highlands battle continued. On the second full day of combat, June 7th, Bumstead's Tigers wandered right into the middle of an enemy base camp. By mid-afternoon, they were under a tremendous amount of fire, and the new skipper was beginning to crack under the strain. Charlie Company, under the command of Wayne Dill, moved to reinforce and got into a wild fight of its own. Willis, who'd been in a tough fight since his Aboose jumped off the day before, also went to the rescue while we kept the Tigers alive with artillery fire, blasting with pinpoint precision around their position. Meanwhile, word came that the Tigers had taken terrible casualties. Among them was the reporter Ward. A wounded civilian was a drama we didn't need at this moment. The only thing worse was the news that Dill's unit, having extricated itself from one fight, had again locked horns with the enemy just 100 metres from the Tigers as night fell. Willis's Aboose formed a perimeter around the Tigers and the beleaguered members of Charlie Company, giving all within a chance to breathe while continuing to slug it out with the enemy themselves. From the Tigers came word that 8 of the wounded were critical. Without medevac, they wouldn't last until morning. But medevac seemed like an impossible dream. No way could a chopper land at the Tiger position, heavily wooded and ringed as it was by determined, well-entrenched enemy troops, and in the dark. Yet still, an all-volunteer chopper crew dared to try it. They used a USAF H-44 Husky rather than a Slick or other medevac aircraft. The bird hovered over the Tigers, and one by one the brave crew winched the 8 critically wounded on board as the enemy fired enthusiastically at them from below. All 8 cases made it off the battlefield alive, but later, when EDAB, my EXO, brought me the casualty list from the brigade collecting station, the flawless operation suddenly displayed a worrisome hitch. The civilian reporter's name was not among those reported to be evacuated from the Tigers. Civilians had priority in this kind of situation, so I was pretty concerned when I called Bumstead. He explained that Ward had refused evacuation because there were men far more seriously wounded who deserved priority. It was an exceptional gesture on the reporter's part, and one that won me for life. Through it, Ward just joined the Brotherhood and became my friend, and little did I know that my life would never be the same again when the balance of the Tigers had been sprung and had come home the next morning. They had just 16 effectives, 9 of whom were wounded, and a single NCO, Pelham Bryant, who, fortunately for the Tigers, was one of the best ever to come along. We filled up the unit with new volunteers, but whatever plans I may have had for them or my companies went on hold in the afternoon when Hank Emerson called me and said his SEA company was in a big jam and about to be overrun. Battered, Willis and the Aboose, who had already been in constant tough contact with the stubborn NVA for more than 2 full days, were in the best position to go to the rescue. I turned them around and sent them on their way. For better control of the operation, I made Ben Opicon Emerson, but being the mother hen that I was, I set one of my radios on the 502 Battalion frequency to make sure he was okay. What happened next on June 9th, 1966, was one of the great tragedies of the entire 2-year battle. The 327 had so far borne the brunt of the fighting at Do To, and would continue to do so for 10 more hard-slugging days. But the newspapers did not report that Ben Willis and the Abuse got into the fight of their lives that day, taking 26 wounded and 6 dead on the way to rescue the 502, or that one of Ben's platoon leaders, Lieutenant Ken Collins, had his eye blown out during the battle, but continued directing his platoon, holding his eyeball in his hand. Nor did they report that when the whole thing was over, Ben's men, wounded and all, refused to be lifted out, determined as they were to go out under their own steam. Instead, the headlines blared that West Point football hero Captain William S. Carpenter, Jr., once an All-American lonesome end and now commander of the 502, dropped napalm on his own troops. The reason for this drastic course of action, so the story went, was that Carpenter was surrounded, had taken heavy losses, and believed his unit was on the verge of being overrun, with the enemy already swarming among his people. When the incident was over, it turned out that his unit had suffered some 6 KIA and 25 seriously wounded. Enemy dead on C Company's hill were as scarce as hen's teeth. The publicity that ensued was not Carpenter's fault, nor were the John Wayne embellishments of the story each time it was reported. Still, in terms of unit pride and unit rivalry between the 502 and the 327 units that had stood back-to-back at Bonnier 20 years before, taken the best the enemy could dish out, and stopped them cold, the effect of the affair was devastating. Ironically, when it was all over, about the only one among the men of the 327 who had a good word to say about the tragic incident was Ben Willis, whose Abuse had taken the brunt of it in the effort to relieve Carpenter's company. "I can't in my heart blame Carpenter for anything he did," he said. "Unless you're there on the ground in that damn jungle, under that triple canopy, nose to nose with the other guy, you don't know. And if you don't know, you shouldn't pass judgment." Ben was right, of course, but for me, as the battalion commander of one damn heroic battalion, it didn't make the heavy Abuse casualties or all the Carpenter headlines any easier to swallow. The next day, the refitted Tigers were on their way out again to join Dill's Charlie Company in the attempt to relieve Willis, who was still engaged. Dill found himself in continual contact throughout the day, and Willis was left on his own to conduct a nighttime withdrawal from his position. By that time, Pearson had told me a B-52 arc light strike was on the way. I left Charlie Company, which remained in contact much of the next day, and the Tigers in the area until the very last moment, fixing the NVA in place with dummy radio traffic so the enemy wouldn't realize we were pulling out in preparation for it. The arc light strike dropped silently from 30,000 feet, cracking like 1,000 thunderbolts on impact, leaving the ground pockmarked with deep craters like the dark side of the moon. Both the 502 and the 327 went in right afterward with little resistance. It was estimated the $1 million strike was responsible for some 200 enemy casualties. Like most of the men in the battalion, I went from the 6th to the 12th of June with no sleep. I was a walking zombie by the time we pulled back for the B-52 strike. As soon as Willis got out and we got him refitted, I hit the sack for 12 straight hours, and I doubt if I ever slept better in my life. Fortunately, the first couple of post-arc light days were quiet, giving everyone a chance to catch up on much-needed rest. Only then did the monsoons come. Luck alone had brought them late, but their absence had been decisive. The NVA's plan had been to lure a major US unit into this area of Vietnam at a time when the terrain and weather favoured them. If the NVA had had their way, the monsoonal rains, mists and low cloud cover would have rendered our air power impotent, and only 2 forces, theirs and our infantry, would have squared off against each other at Do To. In that scenario, they thought the Americans would have been chewed up just as we'd been in the past. But while the good weather did foil the NVA plan, I felt sure they would have had a harder time with the 1st Brigade than they'd expected. Even if the weather had gone their way, we'd learned quite a bit over the last year, and notwithstanding air power, for the most part, We had refused to attack the enemy's buzzsaw. The only time we really played into their hand was during the relief of Carpenter, and had that not all happened so quickly, I might have recognized that the 502 Company, like Tarang, was just the lure, and that it was the relief element, the abuse, that was really the juicy morsel the NVA was after. It would have been good had Operation Hawthorn, the name given to the relief of the 2 Morang outpost and the subsequent events, ended after the B-52 strike. As it was, the search and destroy missions in the area continued, and on the 17th of June, the weary Abuse, low in NCOs and platoon leaders, high in new replacements, and guys just days from rotation, made contact with a small NVA force. There was no point in taking a lot of casualties. Willis played it safe and called for fire support, but the first aircav gunships that came to his aid made a terrible error. Instead of shooting up the enemy, they shot up the Abuse, wounding 21, including Willis, and the rest of the officers, most of the NCOs, and worst of all, every single medic, and killing XO George Perry. Perry was not so good at poker, but very good buddy with a tiny piece of shrapnel through the heart. It was a tragedy only compounded by the fact that Perry, 2 weeks over his Deros, hadn't even had to be there. He just wanted to help Ben and his beloved Abuse, and the plan had been for him to take the first resupply chopper out, get his gear, and go home the next day. It was a damn shame. Word of the fiasco quickly got to my taxi. I immediately grabbed Darrell and called Raphael at his aid station at Dak. Raphael, in turn, grabbed Milton Turner, the medical platoon leader, and a medic named Nichols. Together with a couple of engineers with chainsaws, they made their way by chopper to the battle area. There was no landing zone near the company's position, hence the chainsaws to cut one out, just steep hills and thick forest, no different from most of the highlands. In my command centre, I told the pilot to get as low as he could. We churned through the underbrush, the chopper blades cracking like gunfire against the bamboo and treetops as we cut a hole, inching us toward the jungle floor about 15 feet above what might have been the LZ. Darrell and I jumped out and radioed Raphael that this would be the only way in for him and his people too. The doc was none too enthusiastic about the idea of jumping in, but when he got to the site, the longer his chopper hovered with him sitting inside it, the more he started thinking he'd be a lot safer on the ground than up in the air. In his mind's eye, he could vividly see an enemy trooper taking aim at him at that very moment. After a very long few seconds, it just became too much for him, and he jumped out of the bird, picked up his aid bags, and headed into the bush. Turner and Nichols were delayed in joining Raphael in patching up Ben and his troops when the engineers jumped out of their chopper and each promptly broke an ankle. But soon things started getting squared away. Luckily, Willis wasn't hurt too badly and could stay with the company. When there was nothing more to be done, Raphael and Turner hopped onto the last medevac chopper out without even a goodbye, leaving young Nichols, Darrell, and me out there without ponchos, without anything to protect us from the torrential rains that followed that night. Having assumed the good doctor would want to suffer right along with me, I was a little aggravated that Raphael hadn't stuck around, but I couldn't really blame him. After all, he'd been there when we needed him to care for the wounded and set an example for the medics in his charge, and he hadn't even had to do that. No one forced Raphael Benjamin, the battalion surgeon, to tag along on operations or to jump figuratively or literally into the fry. Though that was exactly what he did throughout some of the worst of the 327's fighting at Tuhoa and Douto. The adventure part had died quickly for this civilian doctor, whom I considered among the bravest of the brave. Still, he was always there because he knew we needed him. In just the same way, the gutsy 40-man medical platoon Raphael oversaw knew we needed them. Consequently, they flinched at nothing, and, as a unit completely turned over 3 times in 1 year, they performed miracles, stopping bleeding, stopping shock, relieving pain with morphine, and getting IVs going to pump life into broken fighters. Many packed M16CS along with their 40-pound medical kits, but their job was to save lives, not take them. They risked their own again and again, answering calls that took them right into the line of fire, machine gun, mortar, sniper, mines, without hesitation. Their most powerful medicine was their encouragement. "You've got it made, just a scratch, you'll see that girl again." A never-ending patter to keep minds occupied, while deft hands administered aid or tried to sort out a stomach or a chest ripped open by shot. Grievously wounded soldiers were further assisted by the brave pilots who performed medevac missions, but it was the medics who made the difference on the ground until the choppers could get in. Selfless and serving beyond good sense, countless medics died in the line of duty to save not just their buddies, but the life of every man who fell on the battlefield. From 2 wars, it is these men, the medics, the docs, who hold the most special place of respect and trust in my infantryman's heart, and I'm sure there are a couple of million other men in the United States alone who feel the exact same way. On the 18th of June, a resupply aircraft arrived at Willis's position with the poncho I'd neglected to take along with me in my haste to get to the Abuse the day before. The first thing I did was brush my teeth in the jungles of the Central Highlands. It was about the only thing you could do to remember you were a civilized human being. You couldn't wash up there during the monsoons. You were always wet anyway. You couldn't shave. The slightest nick, like the inevitable cuts, rashes, or jungle sores, turned septic. The damp, dark jungle was not particular. Everything rotted there. Your boots, your clothes, your skin. So much for my insistence on an extra pair of dry socks. I learned not to wear them at all at due toe, or undershorts either, since you couldn't keep them dry anyway. The only purpose they served was to rub you raw and start the rot. It was a hell of a way to have to fight. We spent the day beating around in the woods, but no contact was made. The enemy force had pretty well vacated the area after the severe beating we'd given them. We figured they'd slipped back into Cambodia to regroup. With that word finally came that we'd be heading back to the Brigade's D back to base, where it had all begun some 17 days before. General Pearson popped into my forward CP to tell me about the move back. "I've given Emerson the aircraft. They're going to pick him up first and then come back and get you." I quietly imploded. The 327 had done the bulk of the fighting. The 502 ended up getting all the press and all the glory as a result of the Carpenter incident. Now, to top it off, Emerson's people were getting the aircraft and going home before mine. "Never mind, sir," I told the general. "I don't want any choppers. I'll walk my battalion out of here." "What do you mean?" asked Pearson. "We'll just sweep back," I said. "I've got over 100 replacements in the last 2 weeks. Almost all the platoon leaders and NCOs are new. It'll give them a good shakeout, and we'll screen the battle area right back to the airfield." The 10-mile walk took a night and a morning, and it was a good training exercise, not just for the new men, but for the guys who'd been there all along, if only to shake out their hangover from the big fight. We made no contact, but almost lost a man when a viper crawled into his fart sack and bit him. A night medevac saved his life, and the rest of the journey was without incident. Just shy of DAC 2 proper, I sent a radio message to Battalion S1 Glenn Mallory to bring out the battalion colours and company guidons. I assembled the company commanders and told them we were going to march home, walking tall and showing the 502 and the rest of the brigade who the real soldiers were in this outfit. Soon my well-proven battalion had lined up at proper intervals in a column on each side of the road, and we began to hike home. I was leading, followed by the colours, my command group, and the Tiger commander, and then the rest of the battalion, each company led by their individual commanders and company guidons. As we got closer to the base camp, the little entrance Glenn Mallory and I had set up started to build. It was as if someone had said, "Hey, there's a parade," and everyone wanted to get into the act. All the support people rushed to the side of the road to cheer us on, even an ad hoc band that started playing Stars and Stripes Forever. With every cheer, my boys stood taller, and their stride grew that much jauntier. As we passed the 502 assembly area, about 20 feet from the road stood Hank Emerson by his CP. He was fresh out of the shower and shaving. He looked toward the road for a moment, his mouth agape, and then he just shook his head. "Hackworth, you son of a expletive," he called with a smile. "Above the rest, sir!" I shouted and gave him a snappy salute. It was a rare thrill to outgun the gunfighter in a totally uncoordinated effort. People were coming from everywhere to look at the warriors. General Pearson had even fallen out with his staff in front of Brigade HQ to salute the battalion as we marched by. Just before I peeled off to join them, a group of aviators did an impromptu 5-airplane flyover of the columns in our honour. I, too, saluted my fine companies as they strutted past, filthy and unshaven, jungle boots rubbed white with wear, still with camouflage in their helmets, some bandaged up and limping like little drummer boys. It was then and forever the proudest moment of my life. We'd taken 27 dead and 129 wounded, but we'd killed 276 NVA. For the price, the men had fought bravely and well against terrific odds and in challenging conditions. They'd been in Vietnam for a year, and they'd learned. By the time I finished my first tour of Vietnam, the infantry school at Fort Benning was again in full swing, mass-producing infantry officers to replace the combat and rotation losses of units fighting in the war. I wanted to go there as an instructor when my tour with the 101st ended. To date, the infantry school had not had the benefit of combat people fresh off the battlefield with us units to pass on lessons learned, and I couldn't think of a place my experience or talents would be better used. Instead, newly promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, I was assigned to the Office of Personnel Operations, OPO, at the Pentagon. On paper, this was a very important career assignment, a key punch on the old ticket. In reality, it was a 2-year jail sentence in an office deep within the bowels of the Pentagon, with little more to do than sign papers for the 25 civilians I apparently managed, but who kept me and my deputy, Major William Curson, blissfully ignorant of what was really going on. No eager soldiers on limited tours were going to disturb their well-oiled bureaucracy. Throughout the 6-week leave I took between Vietnam and the beginning of the Pentagon assignment, no amount of pleading on my part was enough to sway the career managers that it would be much better for me and the Army to send me to Fort Benning. Consequently, I sold my house in Tennessee, bought a new one in Burke, Virginia, and in the course of things got to know Patty and the kids again. As hard as life is for the Army wife, for the children it is that much harder. Dad is seldom there, and when he is for any length of time, it generally means the family's about to move again. New house, new school, new friends. Laura and Leslie, not yet 7 and 6 years old, were on their 4th such move. At 14 months, Joel was too young to understand that part of Army life, but it was just as well. Having suddenly lost his year-long position as Lord of the Castle, he had enough on his plate trying to figure out who the hell this strange man was who called himself his father and wouldn't let him sleep in Patty's bed. Also, kids, my kids anyway, got away with murder with their mother in charge. Undoubtedly it was quite a shock to their little systems when I came back with a whole new set of rules and banished anything less than ordered chaos from my home. I don't think it was easy for any of us at first, but the worst part was that just when we were beginning to function really well as a family again, I was on a plane back to Vietnam. By then I'd been at the Pentagon for 2 stir-crazy months, but just before Thanksgiving the sun began to shine in my windowless subterranean office. Without warning, Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall came to visit. I was stunned. S.L.A. Marshall, as he was known, was a legend of sorts in the Army. He'd walked and talked with the greats, Eisenhower, Ridgway, Patton, Bradley, and he was the author of such widely read books as Night Drop and Men Against Fire from his World War II days, and The River and the Gauntlet and Porkchop Hill from Korea. He was a historian-turned-military analyst, considered by some to be the American expert on soldiers in combat. To be sure, he was fascinated by the ultimate game of war. He had already been to Vietnam, where his study of the 101's Highlands fighting provided the material for his soon-to-be-published Battles in the Monsoon. I'd met him during that trip when he was interviewing the participants of our DAC to fight, a fight that would win the brigade a Presidential Unit citation. In the months since, we'd had occasional contact, always when the general was chasing down some detail to go in his book. But I had not seen him, nor was there any reason why I should have. which made his sudden visit in civilian gear to my Pentagon cranny all the more mysterious. General Marshall came right to the point. "Hack, I've been talking to Johnny Johnson, and we both feel the Army has dropped the ball in Vietnam. We aren't learning from our experience there. The lessons learned are not being recorded and passed on, and we're taking unnecessary casualties because of it. Now, I told Johnny I'd go back and set up a system that will use my post-combat interrogation techniques, but I'd like you to come with me. I'm too old to be trudging around battlefields on my own. Besides, we click well together, and it'll get you out of the Pentagon." In our previous correspondence, I'd made no secret of my hatred for the aptly named five-sided puzzle palace. I was flabbergasted. For weeks and weeks, I'd badgered and harassed OPO's infantry branch for a change of assignment. I'd been told to keep quiet or risk ruining a promising career, and I'd finally taken another step forward in the ticket-punching parade by accepting that guidance in the interest of the bigger things my counselor said I was earmarked for. But then in walks SLA Marshall, a man whose World War II books I'd read and reread since childhood, a man whom I was admittedly in awe of, and offers me not just an out from my horrible job, but the opportunity of a lifetime. It was almost unbelievable. "When do we leave, sir?" I asked. General Marshall told me the Chief of Staff would want to see me before we headed off, in just over a week's time. Even so, when I was called to Johnson's office, I felt not unlike a parish priest might feel upon being told to report to the Pope in Rome. I viewed the meeting as a rare opportunity to have the Chief's ear, so I prepared a list of points to squeeze into my audience with him, all regarding what I felt was needed to improve our combat efficiency in Vietnam. Much to my disappointment, when I arrived at his office, I was told exactly 5 minutes had been scheduled for our meeting. "Take no more," said the General's aide, Colonel William Caldwell. "The old man has a very busy afternoon. You'll be in and out." I'd met General Johnson once before, about a month earlier, at an award ceremony, then as now, when I was called in to see him. I was struck first by the size and splendour of his office and by the windows. Wonderful windows we, in the dark depths of the Pentagon, could only dream of. They looked out over the swollen Pentagon parking lot and beyond to the Potomac. The Chief greeted me in his formal, no-nonsense way. At the age of 54, Harold K. Johnson was the youngest Chief of Staff since Douglas MacArthur, a notable achievement for a man who had spent 3 years of World War II in Japanese prisoner-of-war camps after the fall of Bataan. Tall, straight and handsome, Johnson looked every bit the Chief of Staff. He was a sincere, kind and genuinely good man, who, word had it, was also devoutly religious, with a deep dislike for such soldierly pursuits as hard liquor, fast women, or foul barracks talk. I knew to be on my best behaviour. "Sit down, Colonel," he said to me. "Now, I want to brief you on your mission with General Marshall." It took him about 3 minutes, the gist being that, with a view toward improving the collection of basic data on US fought battles in Vietnam for a future official Army history of the war, Slam would teach the after-action reporting techniques he'd pioneered during World War II to selected US Army officers in all divisions and separate brigades in the theatre. Because General Marshall would be visiting Vietnam as a private citizen, Johnson went on to explain, "My job throughout the tour, rather than simply assisting him, would be that of representative of DA's Chief of Military History." Privately, I didn't understand the General Marshall as private citizen twist, but I barely had a chance to contemplate it when General Johnson, after a considered pause, said, "Take care with Slam, Colonel. He is the Army's powerful friend, but he can be a treacherous enemy." I masked my surprise. As far as the conversation I was following went, that comment came straight out of left field. With 2 minutes left out of my 5, it was small talk time. The General had met my family at the awards ceremony, and now he asked how they were and how my work was going. "Everything's fine, General," I replied, painfully conscious of the clock running out. "But, sir, if you have a minute, there's something bothering me that I'd like to discuss with you." "Let's hear it," he said. "We've had US Army units in Vietnam for 18 months, I blurted out. "Almost 1/3 of the Army is committed to that war, but at Fort Benning there is only a handful of field-grade officers with Vietnam experience, and half of these were advisors. They weren't with us units. We're just not putting our best and most recently experienced combat officers into the school system, which is where I believe they belong. We're sending them everywhere else to get their tickets punched, as if their careers took priority over the war. Vietnam is the toughest war we've ever fought, and we're going at it as though we're fighting World War II all over again. Now, just a minute, Colonel Hackworth, the general bristled. In terms of enemy and terrain, the fighting in Vietnam is no different for infantry than when we fought in the Philippines after Pearl Harbor. Sir, I said, that statement is about as far from the truth about the nature of the war in Vietnam as I have ever heard. I couldn't believe the words had come out of my mouth. I could feel my face getting hot as General Johnson, red-faced with anger, stared at me from behind his desk. After a moment, he leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. He picked up his phone and called his aide. "Cancel all my appointments for the rest of the afternoon," he said. Then he turned to me, his face grim and his voice icily stern. "I will give you the rest of the day to justify that remark, Colonel Hackworth." Johnson walked briskly over to a large work table across from his desk and pulled out some Vietnam battle maps. "Every general who has fought in Vietnam has briefed me at this desk and with these maps," he said. I'd gotten his attention, so I decided to go for broke. "Sir, maybe that's the nub of the problem. Maybe those generals do not know how different the war is. Either in my experience over there, and I have to admit I was only with one brigade, but we were all over Vietnam and I talked to a lot of people. The only people who really know how to fight this thing are the Australians and the Viet Cong." General Johnson and I talked at the work table for about an hour and a half. We refought the 101's battles at Tu Hoa and Dak To, discussed enemy tricks and tactics, and how, until we'd learned, the brigade fell for the enemy's lures and got itself chewed up again and again. When I'd made my case, the general put his arm around me and walked me to the door of his office. "Son," he said, "I'm going to think about all you've told me. I'm sure you've made some valid points, but if you're right, I must say it is most discouraging. I only hope this tour with Slam proves you wrong." Johnson patted my back. "I'll have a look at what's happening at Fort Benning too," he said. "Meanwhile, Colonel, good luck." I felt as though I'd won him over. I really did, and it felt great. At the end of the day, I met General Marshall for a drink. I told him about my meeting with the Chief of Staff and how knocked out I was that Johnson would compare Vietnam to Bataan or island combat. Marshall said, "I agree with Johnny. Infantry combat is infantry combat." I could have fallen off my chair. Did he really believe that? I wondered. But I had no time to ask him, because just then we were joined at our table by one of Slam's old friends, General Moshe Dayan. When you travelled with Slam, I was beginning to discover it was first class all the way. The former Chief of Staff of the Israeli Army had recently returned from Vietnam, where he'd looked at damn near everything. He'd accompanied platoon and company-sized US units deep into the highlands jungles, something I never heard of any American general doing in Vietnam at any time throughout the US involvement. He'd observed larger actions too, and come away incredulous over the American style of war. He thought our companies were too eager to rush to battle at any price. He was amazed at our use of firepower, citing one case where the Americans fired more than 20,000 rounds of artillery in a single action. Yes, Dayan admitted, the action did result in some 200 enemy dead, but at a price of more than all the artillery used during the Sinai campaign. Dayan's personal study had shown him that the enemy almost invariably had the initiative on the battlefield, and he quoted Mao's rules of warfare verbatim, suggesting that until these simple guidelines were acknowledged by our leaders, the enemy would continue to have the upper hand. Dayan confirmed many of my own thoughts, or more accurately instincts, on the war, which was a great relief given that they were thoughts I'd expressed that very afternoon to the Chief of Staff of our army. General Marshall, meanwhile, countered all the Israelis' arguments with, "We'll wear them down. No one can take the kind of punishment we're dishing out and win. Look at the Germans and the Japanese." Finally, having now heard Vietnam compared to World War II twice in one day by no less than the Army's boss and one of America's top military analysts, I decided it was best to excuse myself and go home to wish Patty and the kids a happy Thanksgiving and a Merry Christmas. I wouldn't be home for the next 4 months. You see, the poor Army family, both United States Army Vietnam, USRV, and MACV, Saigon headquarters, were incredibly plush and worlds away from the city that throbbed just beyond their respective gates. Outside were taxicabs and bicycles and beautiful girls with long black hair and lovely odes that flew like kites in the steamy breeze. Inside were charts and graphs and aides and assistants bustling busily through air-conditioned rooms. The staffs of both HQs, officer and enlisted, wore jungle fatigues complete with the new canvas black embossed insignia recently developed to be sniper-proof in the bush. They wore the cleated canvas boots of the warriors too, but unlike the real warriors whose battle scars were mirrored in those boots rubbed white by rocks and undergrowth, these rear echelon commandos, or rear echelon guys as they were known in the parlance of Vietnam, were peacetime army perfection. The only thing mirrored in their gleaming, polished boots were the overhead lights in their busy offices. I would have been amused by the whole scene if it weren't for the knowledge that the guys here in these pristine headquarters received the same combat pay as the soldiers who really did the job, living in the mud and risking their lives every day. The MACV briefing General Marshall and I received before we went into the field was suspiciously rosy in its assessment of how the war was going, but it matched well the view Slam had professed to Deanne and me in Washington. As such, the General was positively jubilant as we proceeded on to Saigon's Tan Son Nhut Airport. There, a VIP 2-engine aircraft bearing a 1-star red standard was waiting for us, its pilot, co-pilot and crew chief all lined up in front of the plane, waiting to salute and shake the hand of Slam Marshall. This was a far cry from what I was used to. The way most guys got around Vietnam was by hitchhiking a ride, often after waiting at heliports and airports for hours or even days. But with Slam, it was red carpet treatment all the way. Doors held open, people bowing and scraping wherever he went, and not a moment's delay given his reputation. And all the respect accorded to him, one who had never seen Slam might easily imagine that he was an imposing presence like a MacArthur or a Gavin. He was not. On the contrary, Slam Marshall was a small, very plump man in his mid-60s, whom one would be immediately forgiven for mistaking for an animated sack of potatoes rather than a flag officer. He was undoubtedly the most unmilitary-looking general since the Civil War. His uniform, which he always wore in the field, was permanently wrinkled World War II khakis or fatigues. His shirt pockets, which were always unbuttoned, were home to numerous felt-tipped pens all sticking out. His fatigue cap had embossed on it, front and centre, a general star twice, perhaps 3 times, larger than the regulation size. Marshall actually looked more like a caricature of a general than the real McCoy, but because he wore his ridiculous costume with complete self-confidence, while a trooper or an officer might look at him in utter amazement, he'd never ever allow himself to laugh. When everyone at Tan Son Nhut had finished kissing Slam's ring, we got into the VIP twin-engine and took off on the first leg of what Slam would describe 10 years later in his autobiography as My Journey into Disillusion. He would not be wrong, but all the sad and sorry revelations I would make were still well down the track. That day at Tan Son Nhut, and for the first few weeks of my tour with Slam, I was perpetually high with the mission, the man, and the extraordinary opportunity being with him allowed me as an outsider to play in the inner circle of the general officer world. Our first stop was the 1st Air Cav Division's base camp at An Khê, where we were greeted effusively by its CG, Major General John Jack Norton. Norton was an old friend of Marshall's, the two having met in 1944 when Slam was doing his post-operation study of the Normandy invasion. As the two men reminisced, I stood back and marvelled at the metamorphosis of the 1st Air Cav's Highlands home. It bore almost no resemblance to the place the 101st had secured for the Flying Horsemen in mid-1965. What had then been a village of perhaps 2,500 mostly mountain people had sprung up into a ticky-tacky cardboard instant city with more than 18,000 Viet and Montagnard camp followers. The jungle was gone. The Cav had chopped it away to build a barricade 18 kilometres in circumference, inside which was the base camp, a fine airfield, and the towering Hao Cao mountain which sat in the middle like a silent giant. Choppers and fixed-wing aircraft filled the sky overhead, and many more could be seen dotting the long runway or in sandbagged revetments on either side. The first air cav truly was a going concern, and if everyone were looking for a we're-winning reading on the wartime barometer, Unkei was certainly it. General Marshall and I went to work immediately, setting up the first of 4 schools to teach his post-combat interviewing technique, essentially a copy of the system police use for reconstructing a crime. Marshall's method entailed bringing together the participants of whatever action was to be reviewed, and, with a trained interviewer guiding the discussion, reconstructing that action as a group. For SLAM's schools, the actions we examined were recommended to us by a unit's operations people or commander, and we conducted the interviews at the base camp or by visiting the participant units near their own positions. While each man, whatever his rank, was allowed to speak freely about what had happened on the ground, the reason the interviews were conducted in groups rather than with individuals was to minimize the bullcrap factor. The men kept one another on track so that a fuller picture could be developed with everyone's input, but a truer one with a minimum of exaggeration. It was a very good system, and though the fighters eagerly did most of the talking, the interviewer was a crucial element because a good one could capitalize on the tiniest scraps of information to get to the crux of a story. Yet the interviewing drill itself could be as simple as a trooper saying, "Small arms fire was tearing into us. I saw 4 men go down, and then I saw Whitey running up on my left holding a grenade." And then the interviewer breaking in to say to Whitey, who would also be among the participants gathered for the occasion, "Okay, Whitey, what happened then?" The object of the endeavour for Slam and me was not to draw conclusions about the fights we examined in the schools, though it would quickly prove unavoidable, like the disturbing observation that a year after Ladang, the air cav was still looking for big battles, still wargaming huge, totally unimaginative hammer and anvil operations a la Benning, though the enemy had long before reverted to economy of force tactics that made the Cav's World War II approach like swatting flies with a sledgehammer. Instead, our job was simply to train our students, all officers from the Army's military history detachments already in place in Vietnam, in a method of after-action scrutiny that could be easily set up and maintained in their own units. They were the ones to draw conclusions from their own battles while collecting their historical data and making any fallout lessons learned available to their commands to prevent the same mistakes from being repeated in future engagements. A tireless worker, General Marshall conducted all the interviews in the first school, while the officer students observed the technique. Slam really was a master at it, with a natural feel for battle and a great understanding of squad and platoon tactics, his specialty. He also had a most incredible memory bordering on total recall. On one occasion, he stunned everyone in the room when he turned to a burly old soldier, a platoon sergeant in his mid-30s, and insisted he knew him, though the sergeant was positive they'd never met. "It's in my book, Night Drop," said Slam. "I met you at Normandy right after the 82nd jumped in at St. Mary Glee. You were in the 2nd Battalion, 325th Glider Regiment." "No, sir," said the sergeant. "That wasn't me, but I'll be damned if you're not talking about my older brother. He was in the 325 Glider, just like you say." We stayed at Unkei for 2 weeks, working solidly by day and enjoying the expansive hospitality of General Norton by night. The CG was most supportive of Slam's effort here in Vietnam and made sure our every need and comfort was looked after, both in the field and in the Cav's Hilton-like VIP quarters where we were put up. We ate in the General's Mess, a room with 3 long tables forming a horseshoe, the head of which was reserved for the generals and VIP guests like Slam. The staff and less important guests like me sat opposite one another at the 2 legs perpendicular to the general's table, and throughout each evening's 3-course, 5-star quality gourmet meal presented on fine china embossed with the CAV insignia and served by waiters in starched white jackets, probably line infantrymen who'd found a home in the rear, we politely eavesdropped on what the VIPs were saying. There was little, usually no talk of war during these formal dinners. In fact, you'd never even know a war was going on unless the generator sputtered, coughed, and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Fortunately, an efficient generator operator, probably another line soldier who'd found the good life in the rear, would promptly switch on the backup unit, and the lights would go on all over the mess hall, usually just in time for after-dinner cigars, liqueurs, coffee, and conversation, at which time the guests normally told some well-worn anecdotes. Slam was a marvellous storyteller, and as the senior guest, most evenings of our stay with the CAV, he held the mess hall floor. One night, however, I found him sharing the spotlight with author John Steinbeck, who was in Vietnam to visit his son, a radio announcer for the Armed Forces Network in Saigon, and to take home all the good news on the war effort. In his last years of life, Steinbeck was in pretty shocking physical condition, particularly compared to Marshall, his contemporary. The two distinguished guests had equally healthy egos, though, and there soon proved to be insufficient room at the head table to contain them both. At the happy hour before dinner, the two old men spent their time sniffing at each other like bulldogs. Throughout the meal, normally cheerful, twinkly-eyed Slam had been stony-faced as his Nobel Prize-winning rival showed him the respect he might show a copyboy for an insignificant weekly rag. When dinner was finished, the two men spent the rest of the evening fighting for the floor to deliver their respective tales of the time they talked to kings or presidents. By the time the whole thing was over, I'm sure I wasn't the only one to gratefully tumble into bed, absolutely exhausted. After reconstructing 2 of the first Air Cav's actions for the students of the first school, we said goodbye to Jack Norton and his luxurious An Khe home, and flew off to the equally sumptuous 1st Division base camp at Da Nang. The base camp mentality in Vietnam was an outgrowth of the static days of the Korean War. Back then, the Vietnam-era generals had been majors and lieutenant colonels on the outside looking enviously in. No doubt many of them had thought, "When I'm a general, I'll have that too." And now that they were going to, even if the base camps had even less place in this war than they had in the last. In Vietnam, a frontless war, the security requirement alone at these base camps was massive. At the 1st Air Cav, an entire brigade, fully 1/3 of the division, was engaged solely in protecting the units and An Khe home. Similarly, by the time I'd left the 101st in June, 1/3 of its combat power was tied up guarding Pan Rang in the 101st. This was particularly significant in that, when we'd originally gone to Phan Rang, the position was almost Charlie-free, but the longer we stayed, the more interest the enemy took in the place. By the time I left, they were regularly blowing up vehicles, lobbing an occasional mortar shell, and doing selective sniping. So, almost by design, the base camp invited enemy activity, and then depleted the fighting strength of a unit in the effort to counter it. Frontline troop strength was continually drained too by the number of men needed to stay behind simply to service the base camps as they grew bigger and more plush. And in that, the camps created an extra layer of diversion in which a trooper fresh out of the hospital or back from R&R could lose himself before returning to his unit. It wasn't long before these massive installations were really as much the enemy as the enemy himself. But you'd be hard-pressed trying to convince the high-living generals of that, or even Slam, who took to such splendour as if it were his God-given right. As for myself, no doubt I was initially seduced by the good life at An Khe, and even at first in Da Nang, where I was assigned to share the air-conditioned bungalow complete with a bar in the corner of the living room and a full-time maid who kept shoes polished, clothes washed and pressed, and beds made with perfectly starched white sheets of one of the Big Red One's division commanders, Bernard Rogers. But my enthusiasm disappeared pretty quickly when I saw the terrible complacency such living engendered. ADC Rogers, for example, emerged from his room each morning wearing pyjamas and a dressing gown. Worse, even though the information we gained during SLAM's schools exposed critical deficiencies in the US effort, from the level of the individual soldier all the way up the chain of command. Most of the generals at their evening happy hour seemed blissfully unconcerned, if not totally unaware, that any such problems existed. Operation Attleboro was a prime case in point. With more than 20,000 Americans involved at the height of the fighting, and more air and artillery used than on D-Day of the Normandy invasion, as of December 1966, Attleboro was the biggest operation of the war so far. And according to Colonel Stoutner, G32 Field Force, who practically begged SLAM to study it as part of his second school, it was nothing less than a classic, brilliant victory over the Viet Cong. But something smelled very funny to SLAM and me about the perfectly planned, stunningly fought, triumphantly concluded battle. Our briefer's contention that the Viet Cong no longer controlled their time-honoured refuge of War Zone D, for one thing. And indeed, when SLAM and I took Stoutner's suggestion and turned our undivided attention to Attleboro, what we found was an operation that was rotten through and through. Attleboro was initiated in the middle of September by the 196th Brigade, the first US brigade of its kind to fight in Vietnam. Less than a year before, the unit had been a band of 2,000 raw recruits. After 6 months of training from "this is a rifle" to 2 to the brigade in the attack, this instant unit had been declared combat-ready and prepared to deploy to the Dominican Republic to replace the 82nd Airborne Element that had been there since the beginning of the unrest. But at the last moment, the 196th was rerouted to Vietnam. The new destination would prove a hell of a place for them to wet their feet because, all declarations to the contrary notwithstanding, the 196th was not combat-ready. The unit had not been trained correctly from the outset. The initial NCO cadre was mostly artillery or armour, and even the brigade's operational report for the period ending the 31st of October remarked that the serious shortage of infantry personnel made the training mission extremely difficult to execute. As Steve Praynard always said, "Learn it right and you'll do it right the rest of your life. Learn it wrong and you'll spend the rest of your life trying to get it right." If the 196th's training mission was difficult to execute, it shouldn't have been hard for the powers that be to imagine how a combat mission would go. To make matters worse, Colonel Francis S. Kennedy, the 196th's initial commander and a Medal of Honor winner with a reputation as a good infantry soldier, was relieved when the unit arrived in Vietnam and was replaced by Brigadier General Edward H. Jr., an artilleryman who had never before commanded or served in an infantry unit. So the stage was set for a very messy baptism of fire for the 1st Instant Brigade. From the commencement of Operation Attleboro for almost 7 weeks, the 196th had a leisurely walk in the sun. They made few contacts with the enemy, but accomplished a lot in their wide-ranging mission by uncovering and destroying many VC supply depots and logistical installations. It wasn't until the 3rd of November that the brigade's good life came to an end, when it became apparent the enemy was going to strike back in good World War II fashion. General Dusu requested and got the 25th Division's 27th Wolfhound Battalion to act as the anvil, while 2 of the 196th's organic battalions played hammers to drive the VC into a killing zone. At least that was the plan. On the ground, all intentions quickly went by the boards when C Company, 27th, landed on a cold LZ and proceeded north right into a VC ambush that got them from the front, both sides, and the rear. Within 2.5 hours, the company had taken 14 wounded and 10 killed in action, including the company commander, the first sergeant, one of the platoon leaders, and one of the platoon sergeants, until the 27th Battalion commander, Major Guy Sandy Malloy, came and took control. This senior officer on the ground was a brand-new second lieutenant on his first operation. The 27th was brought in to reinforce its battered sister company and was ordered to roll up the VC's flank. Meanwhile, Dusu ordered 3 companies from 2 of his battalions to go to the rescue. All were made OPCON of the 27th, giving Major Malloy control of 5 companies. By the end of the first day's battle, and by the end of the second day, A wounded Sandy Malloy was simultaneously commanding 11 rifle companies from 4 different battalions in lethal action. The 27th was hanging on in the face of numerous frontal attacks. After being ambushed just as the 27th had been the day before, Du Su began committing unit after unit piecemeal, without rhyme or reason. Somehow all these units ended up under Malloy's operational control, and it was just fortunate that Malloy, the son of General Guy S. Malloy, who 14 years before had taken such an interest in me at Fort Benning, was an able commander with a hell of a lot of troop duty experience under his belt. He fought his ad hoc mini-division beautifully for 30 straight hours until Major General Dayu, late of May, now CG 1st Division, arrived to relieve Malloy's forces and take over the battle from the totally unqualified Du Su. It was at this point, according to all the official reports, that the battle turned in favor of the Americans. Dayu apparently decided to turn the entire region into a parking lot, practicing what he preached as the author of the big U.S. search and destroy operations. He employed huge Rome plow bulldozers that plowed, ripped and sheared through the jungle, leaving bare swaths 1,000 feet wide in which VC movement could be easily spotted from the air. In some areas he had engineers use ditch-digging machines to slash into the Viet Cong's ingenious network of underground tunnels and bunkers, most of which time would prove remained untouched, unshaken, indeed undetected throughout the U.S. involvement that ran through both war zones C and D like a poor man's subway system. Dayu believed in maximum firepower too, and by the time Attleboro was over, a total of 12 tons of tack, 35,000 artillery rounds, and 11 B-52 strikes had rained down on the enemy. Dayu was actively and aggressively seeking what he called the enemy's threshold of pain, the point beyond which he believed the enemy could not sustain the punishment we were inflicting. It was his solution to end the war. Therefore, not unlike Sherman when he marched across Georgia, wherever Dayu went, he left destruction in his wake. In the Iron Triangle, for example, more than 6,000 peasants were moved to refugee camps, and their abandoned villages were burned and bulldozed to the ground, so their land could be declared a free fire zone, with anyone caught within it considered VC fair game for all choppers and spotter planes that hunted there. Defoliants like Agent Orange were sprayed frequently throughout the 1st Division's AO of war zones C and D, and the ground had been bombarded so frequently by B-52 strikes that it looked from the air as if it had been pressed in a waffle iron. Dayu would have had no complaints from me for what appeared to be his Napoleonic, the weaker the infantry, the heavier the employment of cannon philosophy. There was no question that using firepower was better than wasting lives, but the problem was that a lot of lives were being wasted too. Each day, as Slam and I collected our information on Attleboro, visiting unit after unit that had somehow been involved, I got more and more depressed to find the same problems occurring, the same lethal mistakes being made again and again. And they were the exact mistakes we'd made in the 101st as far back as a year before. The Viet Cong, those dumb country hicks or so we perceived them, were still fleecing us city slickers every day. Irrespective of Attleboro's official report of victory, the fact was that the operation, which claimed 155 US lives and another 741 wounded, was just another case of dancing to the enemy's tune, a tune written years before during the Indochina War. The tactics the NVA and Main Force VC employed at Attleboro were right out of Street Without Joy, the standard of the French. I just know the little bastards are somewhere around here, but go and find them in that mess was the same complaint Slam and I heard again and again from the Yankee long-noses. A dozen years later, as their accounts of the fight revealed, the VC initiated or controlled almost every action during Attleboro. They sucked US units into well-prepared killing zones, almost a replay of the lure we fell for at My Lai, and then ate the Americans up at eyeball-to-eyeball range. All our men could do was try their damnedest to extricate their dead and wounded and themselves, and get some distance so they could hammer the enemy with our unbeatable firepower. And yet, when I asked the company and battalion commanders who'd participated in Attleboro whether they'd read Bernard Fall's basic primer on the war, few could answer in the affirmative. During our reconstruction of Attleborough, Slam and I found that other US units were being devastated without meeting the enemy at all. In the 199th Infantry Brigade, for example, one company had taken 60 casualties over a 3-month period, 40 of which had been from booby traps generally constructed of American debris and generously implanted by the VC throughout war zones C and D. I did a quick calculation of how many of the remaining 20 had been friendly fire WIAs, and when it was all shaken out, the enemy might as well have stayed home. To subdue the enemy without fighting, said Sun Tzu, is the acme of skill. This is not to say that these US units were not making any kills. At Attleborough alone, the enemy KIA by body count was reported to be over 1,000. The operations Slam and I studied were hurting the enemy, but it was not at a price the opposition could not sustain. According to one of the basic principles of guerrilla warfare, if the G, guerrilla, is not losing, he is winning, and if the G's opponent is not winning, he is losing. As long as the VC and NVA could sustain their losses, they were not losing the war, whatever defeats their foe ascribed to them. There was no reason to believe they would not be able to continue to sustain their losses, even in the face of Westy and Deu's search and destroy tactics and the rich man's war the Americans were waging. If the VC and NVA lost at Attleborough, it was a conscious decision to run away to fight another day. No doubt they would go to ground and lick their wounds, but just as had been the case in the Indochina War, going to ground was just the first step in rebuilding, strengthening their ranks and their will to prepare to meet us again on the very same ground as before. So even if Operation Attleborough was a victory for us in the World War II sense, that is, we held the ground at the end of the battle, in terms of the material losses in both choppers and ammo used, in the number of US dead and wounded, and the fact that the enemy would and did move right back into the area the minute our units pulled out, Attleborough was a Pyrrhic victory at best, but no one wanted to know. While all the generals Slam and I met seemed wholly behind our endeavour, none showed any real interest in the findings the schools uncovered. The same base camp complacency that did not see the need for self-examination in the first place had led to what appeared to be a total absence of curiosity, even when the hard work was done for them about what was happening around them. I would have liked to tell these generals what we were learning on those many occasions when, to my utter amazement, one or another sought my advice on some future plan. But since Slam never broached the severity of the problems when he was turned to for guidance, I certainly didn't think it was my place. I should have gone right ahead, though. By the time we'd finished the second school, I realized that in the power game I was way ahead and could probably have said anything I damn well pleased. Travelling with Slam, I was accorded respect well beyond that due my rank of lieutenant colonel. I was not a general, and I didn't belong, but the real generals seemed to forget that, or put it aside for the purposes of the trip. At least I was one of them. It didn't hurt that I was representing the Office of the Chief of Military History on the express recommendation of the Army Chief of Staff. Everybody assumed I was tight with General Johnson, and again I found flag officers who wouldn't even have acknowledged my presence at other times slapping my back and acting out the role of big buddies. I was knocked out that the guys who wore stars still had to play the political game, and even more so that they thought I had the power to give any one of them a little career jump. It was General Deu, of all people, who was the most striking example of those who sought to take advantage of my close relationship with the chief. William Eugene Deu was considered by insiders to be the prime architect of America's war in Vietnam, and a principal in the development of the U.S. frontier strategy there. He was an extraordinarily brilliant man, or so went the word, who had made his name as a staff officer, having had little command experience at all and none on the company level. After he took over the Big Red One, Deu quickly became infamous throughout Vietnam for on-the-spot relief, firing some 30 battalion commanders, most within days of their arrival. While this was actually more the work of Deu's no-nonsense ADC for tactics, James Hollingsworth, a gravelly-voiced, colourful character who cursed a blue streak, had 5 Purple Hearts from Africa, Sicily and Europe during World War II, and was undoubtedly the real power and spirit behind the 1st Division. What was interesting was how, when Daewoo finally settled on the battalion commanders he wanted, their average height was at least 6 feet. It was a Frederick the Great thing. I was sure Daewoo himself was very short and ferret-like in both look and manner, and whenever I saw him conferring with his towering subordinates, I couldn't help but think of old Frederick and his runt complex. Still, Daewoo would go on to have an unparalleled impact on the army. Under his continued patronage in subsequent years, his hand-picked Praetorian Guard would slip into the army's top jobs. Daewoo himself would never go all the way to Chief of Staff or Supreme Commander NATO, but his incredible influence as a power broker and the top tiers of the army would have much to do with who did and who did not later. Still, he would expand his base and take on his most ignoble role, that of undeclared head of the crusade to rewrite the history of US involvement in Vietnam, of which he was so much a part. But that was all in the future. In 1966, Daewoo was already a powerful guy. So I was totally unprepared for the ingratiating smile he flashed me when Slam and I arrived at Dion, or the way he took me aside as soon as he could for a private word. Though I'd met with him quite regularly the previous year, when, as J3 of MAV, he'd visited me in my S3 role with the 101st, one thing I never would have expected was to be greeted by Daewoo like a long-lost brother. Daewoo was even more fawning and deferential to Marshall, but since most of the generals we met treated Slam not unlike a king in that respect, his behaviour was unremarkable. "Hack," he said, "I'd like you to do me a favour if you get a chance when you talk to the chief. Just tell him I'm a good man, and tell him sure I curse and carry on a bit, but it's all an act. It's what the troops in the Big Red One expect. So if you could just tell him I'm a good man." Slam and I spent Christmas with the 1st Division. On the 26th, Bob Hope gave his travelling show for a huge Big Red One crowd. It seemed like madness to assemble such a large target for VC mortars and rockets, but the antagonists had declared a ceasefire, and the show went on despite intelligence reports that the Viet Cong would strike during the Christmas truce. I didn't go. Besides the fact that it was mind-boggling to me that Daewoo would take such a mammoth risk with the lives of his men, I'd made a practice of missing Bob Hope shows since Korea because I didn't like his slick brand of humour, and I just preferred to stay with my unit and avoid all the confusion. Slam, on the other hand, was a Bob Hope fan and a distinguished guest at the performance. He was still chuckling when I met him after his return, and repeated what he considered the classic Hope joke. "The US bombing raids on North Vietnam are the best slum-clearing program Uncle Ho ever had." The following day, still during the ceasefire, a VC unit ambushed a 1st Division platoon whose patrol had also violated the truce. The ambush took place less than 2 clicks from the now vacant Bob Hope venue, with the VC armed with both a machine gun and a mortar. A day earlier, they would have made some impact on that show. The Americans took 7 killed in action and several wounded in action. Yet another classic no-one's learning scenario. A young OCS-trained lieutenant had allowed his platoon to cross a wide-open rice paddy. The first I heard of the incident was when Daewoo came dashing into the general's mess, as excited as a second lieutenant going to his first guard mount. He told Slam to saddle up. They were off to battle. As Daewoo dashed out again with Slam in hot pursuit, I marvelled at this incredible example of over-supervision. A division commander rushing to the scene of one of his platoon's open and shut screw-ups. Where were the platoon, company and battalion commanders? Where was the brigade commander? From the information Slam's schools were routinely revealing, most likely they would be on the scene as well, overhead in choppers, all of them issuing orders and playing what became known as the great squad leader in the sky, creating absolute chaos in an already confused situation. Such was not the way to win a war, but the longer the war went on, the worse this situation got. Many senior officers saw their unit's fights and patrols only in terms of the glory it could bring them, or in terms of the medals and ribbons they could win, awards so common that they only became conspicuous by. Their absence in a guy's fruit salad, without leaving the beyond rifle range comfort of 1,200 to 1,500 feet, in the case of Daewoo and Slam, dashing toward the sound of guns. By the time they arrived on the scene, the guns were silent. There was little to do but evacuate the dead and wounded and come home, which they did. For New Year's Eve, I took Slam with me to a party at the New York bar on Tudu Street in Saigon. The place was owned and operated by my dear friend John Westmoreland, who, since his battlefield commission in my fighter company in Korea, had risen through the ranks to make lieutenant colonel. I was so proud. After a couple of early 60s tours of Vietnam, he'd recently quit the army, joined the State Department detachment as a civilian, and come back to the war zone where he'd made a life for himself. He'd met and married a Vietnamese woman named Jackie, who had a penchant for having children and making money. They had one kid already, as well as 2 or 3 very successful bars on Tudu Street. My personal favourite was the New York, with its mirrored walls, Laminex tables, each separated from the next by a curtain, and big American tape decks that blared out down-home country and western and popular Beatles tunes. Troops went there en passe to fall in love with any one of Westy's resident tea ladies, those fragile oriental dolls who melted hearts with their lies. I see you one time, I love you too much. The boys, fresh out of the bush, didn't care as long as they could pretend it was true. Westy had a cosy corner organised for us when we arrived at the bar, and a strikingly beautiful good-time girl for Slam. I'd been more than a little apprehensive about taking him along. Anyone with a discerning eye would say that the New York, like most of the bars on Tudu Street, was actually pretty sleazy, but it proved to be a wasted worry. Slam loved the place. The hardest part of the evening was actually getting from the front door to the table. Very rarely did one see a general on Tudu Street, so when Marshall walked in wearing his distinctive rumpled khakis and huge general star, it caused a tremendous stir. To his great delight, the rest of the evening was drunkenly wonderful. Slam displayed an incredibly earthy side, which meshed perfectly with Westmoreland. When the new year came and went, and Westy suggested we go back to his house to continue the party, Slam was all for it. So everyone paired off and made our way to John's villa, where we drank our way through the dawn. At some stage in the wee hours, Slam and his tea lady disappeared, and I had a good chuckle, thinking the old fox had gotten, or was getting, his ashes hauled by the veteran girl. She was probably the first Vietnamese civilian he'd even talked to. Sadly, all was not as it appeared. In the morning, before I stumbled out of his house, Westy told me the girl had reported in on her night with Slam. "General have many things in head but nothing in dick," she'd said. "He go to sleep right away, but number 1 general big man."